presentation. I am really excited to introduce Sabrina Monarch, who is courageously a first semester student and has offered to give us a presentation, so sharing her knowledge with everybody. She's an evolutionary astrologer, and she writes weekly forecasts at monarchastrology.com and has been in client practice for 40 years and studying astrology, right, for the last 12? Mm-hmm. Astrology for the last 12 years. She's currently teaching a 5-month evolutionary astrology immersion, and this is her first semester in PCC. So please join me in welcoming Sabrina.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm talking about evolutionary astrology today, which is a Pluto-based astrology. It's very much been a living, breathing practice for me. It's been a fire that has been burning within me for years now, and having me make such decisions as entering grad school, being so compelled by the School of Astrology and wanting to find a way to legitimize it further and to gain more insight upon it. So today I want to share just kind of the gestalt or the feeling of this practice and some initial spiritual, intellectual insights about it, theories. And these are things that I would like to develop further as my career and my education continue. And I've also organized this particular talk with some allusions to archetypal astrology and the perinatal matrices, because that is something that, a language that many of you speak. And it's been really exciting to learn that and to build bridges between these two. Evolutionary astrology is Pluto-based astrology. So we start, if we're looking at a natal chart, from Pluto by sign and house. The sign that Pluto is in is kind of like the costume or the cloak that Pluto is wearing, and the house is the area of life, maybe the anchor. Then with the planetary ruler of Pluto, so for example, if we had Pluto in Libra, we would look to Venus, and we also add aspects to Pluto. These start to form a bottom line picture of what does a person really want from this life? Why are they here? Why did we incarnate? And what's really unfinished, something that is still being propelled into completion. From this place in the chart, we look at everything else as something that is emerging out of that bottom line intention. So for a client, or for myself, it just brings up the question of why am I here? Why are you here? But it also brings up the cosmology of why are we here in general? And that's, of course, a question I don't have a definitive answer to, and I don't necessarily need one. But I've found a few really interesting things to think about along those lines. Evolutionary astrology, to answer that question, or begin to answer that question, starts with source, the Neptunian archetype, the oceanic realm from which we all come from and return to. Human consciousness is a phenomenon of a desire to be, for some time, separate from this source. To be experiencing oneself as a wave emerging out of the ocean to which we'll one day return. Pluto here could be the force that propels us. Like in the perinatal matrix, the baby out of the womb. It's the force that propels a wave out of the ocean. Pluto is the force that gets us to form this wave pattern. And the wave pattern specifically is our incarnation. It's our ego. Pluto holds within its archetype the resistance to this return to the ocean, symbolized not just by our inner conflicts, which separate us from the redemptive unity to that oceanic space, but also in our general forgetting of who and what we are beyond this incarnate ego, this contemporary lifetime. The Pluto phenomenon in life correlates to the way that we misplace ultimate security or ultimate trust onto that which comes and goes, rather than what is eternal. The wisdom path of Pluto is to learn how to merge with this temporary life and with all of its temporary experiences and joys, and then to know how to let go. the soul in this cosmology is an individual soul that continues to reincarnate life to life to life. It doesn't complete all the desire that it has in just one wave or one lifetime. Evolutionary astrology posits a teleological nature to the soul, that we keep reincarnating until we're finished, until we've gotten what we've wanted as individual souls, and are able to merge back with the universe or the oversoul, or however it is we choose to look at it. And this could be presumably forever, or maybe it's just as cyclical as we sleep and dream and wake and live and repeat. A dictum of Pluto that has really reached me is that there's no way out but through. The point in this cosmology isn't to renounce Earth life or our desires or our Plutonic self in order to return. The return is through merging with temporary life and letting temporary life go when it is truly exhausted. I'm not going to bypass the process of reincarnation for countless lives by somehow denying the Plutonic. I'll simply suffer consequences of repression for doing so in this life and in future lives. There's a certain degree to which that denial of self misses the point of the self being a wave that emerged from the ocean. And in so doing, perhaps even in its relative smallness, the ego, the incarnation, could be an important piece of creation. Yet in our Plutonic reality, we experience tension and wrestle with this part of ourselves. And similarly, it's like having felt the violence of a wave when you're out swimming in the ocean. Being alive in human form involves being compelled, interested by something, having desire to be here. Desires of all kinds. It could be simply desire to have a particular career, to have romance, or desires that become ever more complex and nuanced, such as a desire to feel deeply alone for long periods of time and to discover what vast inner solitude feels like, to learn about one's inner temple. It could really be anything, what it is we desire. There's no discrimination here. There's as many unique desire stories as there are individual souls or waves. There's a Plutonic fractal pattern that happens in a lifetime and also over a series of lifetimes, which is that the fulfillment of desire naturally leads to the emergence of new desires. When we merge with a desire, we feel satisfied for a moment and then we naturally want something else. A mundane example would just be fulfilling your hunger for lunch and then doing something else with your day. It could also be about finally making enough money to do more than survive and being able to go to school or have a hobby. In infinite permutations, there emerges a teleological nature of desires met, yielding new desires. And this becomes a path by which the soul propels itself to complete its ultimate or many lifetime wave to the return. On the small layer of this fractal, the realization of small desires, so relative to my day or my year, etc., offer the potential of feeling redemption that is like a small slice of what the ultimate Neptunian redemption might feel like. This is if Pluto's not resisted, and if an intelligence can be made out along the path, how we can become more aware of Pluto's problematic qualities, and to garner an understanding of what true power is versus what's force and what's control. Before I'd come into contact with this concept about 5 years ago when I learned about evolutionary astrology, I had really only heard of desire within the context of spirituality as though desire is something to get rid of, that it's the root of all suffering. But I've come to think that it's the complexes we form over our resistance, or the sense of fear we have of lack, or of feeling not empowered to have things, or that there's somehow a block, that we feel the pain of desire. Desire, untangled from these potential consequences of itself, is a propulsive teleological force that can relate to both destruction and redemption alike. So from Pluto's point of view, the point is not necessarily to exhaust desire as though that is some superior value. It's about naturally exhausting them. And that's a more complex conversation to kind of parcel out which desires are destructive and which desires are beneficial, and I'm not going to go into that today. While we look at Pluto as this characteristic of what a person's desire nature is like and what they're at the deepest root levels engaged with, what essentially keeps them coming back time and time again, the shadow emerges here. The shadow and the soul and the underworld are all connected in the multivalence of the Pluto archetype. A lot of the Plutonic shadow qualities of manipulation and control and things like that tend to come from a place of the wave forgetting where or what the ocean is, and starting to project the Neptunian force of source onto ephemeral or temporary things, which one must get in order to feel secure. And therefore, by displacing source, entering a state of suffering and non-alignment with truth, and from its own need for security, enacting manipulation and control and things like that for the sake of emotional security, regardless of the cost. Whereas if a truer sense of power is to emerge, or a more beneficial multivalence of Pluto, the soul can be in alignment with the source of its own interconnection to the wave, or the ocean. The wave then is more self-accurate, aware of itself, and it may be able to hold its source and the value of its temporary travel as a wave with a devotional quality that allows it to make empowered choices and engage in energy exchange in intentional and aware ways. And as a result of Pluto's drive, focus, or obsession, people develop these treasures and gifts and affinities. Okay, I'm aware of time here, so I'm going to figure out what I need to say. Where evolutionary astrology deepens past Pluto is that it enters into a conversation with the lunar nodes. So the south node is kind of like the tail of a mythic dragon, and it relates to these karmic debris that the tail kind of sweeps up. And so for the first, typically there's many mitigating factors in people's charts, but pre-first Saturn return, people tend to repeat certain past life karmas, and it's kind of re-brought up into the field of experience. And where the storytelling medicine of evolutionary astrology can be so powerful is that a lot of these karmas that we're experiencing, we kind of renew our lease on them by reacting to them and creating decisions that further bind us to our karmas. And then the north node of the moon is this head of the dragon. It's kind of like the direction to which the dragon wants to go. It's why we keep incarnating. And this opposite archetype from our past dynamics holds a direction to which the soul can focus its intense energies as to liberate itself from its own psychic swampland of the south node, which is all these habitual patterns. From playing and studying with Pluto for the last 5 years, it has struck me that things like addiction and compulsion and just that intensity of Pluto don't really go away per se. It's a matter of changing the focus and liberating the focus. It's hard to just stop doing something. It's easier to go ahead and switch directions and do something else and liberate all of that intensity and angst and whatever Pluto is fixated around towards another direction. And that's what evolutionary astrology as a practice has yielded a way of reading the natal chart such that this trajectory can be located. Evolutionary astrology has seemed to spiritualize desire and just the human experience in general, adding it into a holistic picture of what we're doing here, rather than the kind of like earth life and spiritual life somehow being separate. I had a few more things that I could say, but I'm also curious if there's any questions that I can use my remaining time for.
Thank you.
Just a very general question on evolutionary astrology and archetypal astrology, which obviously you've been introduced to some degree on arriving at this school. Do you have any thoughts on the differences between the two and what one has to offer compared to the other?
Yeah, I think archetypal astrology seems to more readily bring people into a direct holotropic experience with the planetary archetypes. And evolutionary astrology pinpoints a very sharp, specific storyline, though utilizing multivalence, to come up with the trajectory of a person's soul history using the lunar nodes and the signs.
Can you say anything more about why the nodes? What's the relationship of the nodes to Pluto?
So the lunar nodes relate to the moon, and the moon is about the ego in evolutionary astrology, like the filter of consciousness. And Pluto is the deeper self, like the soul that keeps reincarnating into different egos, and Neptune is the very ultimate holistic unity. So they're all the kind of different versions of self.
Thanks, Sabrina. I got more. You're a very good expositor of evolutionary astrology. I got more insights into its attraction. What would you say about a critique that's often heard in the astrological community about evolutionary astrologers who can have a tendency to kind of present in their readings, their interpretations, a kind of like this is who you were last lifetime, and that highly focused storyline that you mentioned. I mean, it's one thing to have the highly focused storyline in general of evolving reincarnational spiritual evolution over lifetimes, but it's another thing to say this is as a result of what your third house north node and so forth. We can say that you had this past lifetime experience, and to go from house this as a kind of metaphoric, narrative that might help you enter into the issues you're working with, but to present it in a more literalized way. That's often the critique one hears.
Yeah, that's something that I've really drawn from archetypal astrology with in the last couple of years, is accessing multivalence and the larger symbolic language. When I first started trying to work with people with evolutionary astrology, I felt this immediate kind of tension of entering a room and having the task of telling a person who they were, which felt really alienating. And so I turned it around by doing a research project and asked people questions about themselves without reading their chart, but looking at their chart, and tried to find some more real life correlations. I found that the telling of people what they were in a past life isn't necessarily of therapeutic value. I think it's more therapeutic if they have that knowing themselves or experience it. I try more to locate people's patterns and fixations and the alternate, like pretty much the opposite archetype which they've neglected, and if they pay attention to that opposite archetype, it can balance out the story. But not to assign people a story, because it turns them away. Thanks.
For me, in combination with the lunar nodes, I found working with Chiron particularly helpful, especially thinking about transformation and healing in terms of the way that that shows up for people that do want to be in the healing arts, or I would consider that philosophy and all the work that we do at the school and all of the departments is actually healing arts. So that's just my framework. I have Chiron Luna my ascendant, so that's just kind of it's what I'm swimming in. But how does Chiron fit into that framework of evolutionary astrology?
Chiron and the other asteroids tend to just be included as much as an astrologer has a personal relationship to the asteroid and has researched it.
So if it's important to the person, then you can include it in them.
Yeah, because Chiron is a very deep archetype, but there's a few taglines and keywords for it, and those aren't enough necessarily. But if there's a deep, rich experience with the essence of Chiron, usually then an astrologer can incorporate it.
And I feel like there's sort of like a remything that's happening too in these times, that we need to like expand and understand these in a multivalent, but also in a way that is corrective to some of the ways that it carries forward some of these patterns of imbalances that you're speaking of, that are, I would say, symptomatic of the times, and the way that we can be healing by correcting them in the way that we hold these archetypes and work with them in our lives. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.